A huge crowd gathered to watch the execution of King Charles I. Immediately after, some spectators rushed the scaffold, some of whom walked away with a gruesome memento. When the executioner raised Charles I's head before the crowd of onlookers, the realisation set in. The King of England had been killed by his own people. But how did Charles go from an absolute monarch to the chopping block? Charles was born into an uneasy family. His father, James VI of Scotland, and his mother, Anne of Denmark, lived apart for most of their marriage. Charles was James's second son and was never meant to sit on the throne. When his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, died childless, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The entire family moved south to claim the crown, all of them except for one. Charles was a weak and sickly child, and his family believed he wouldn't survive the journey, so they left him behind in Scotland. It wasn't until a year later, when a 3-year-old Charles could walk the length of the Great Hall under his own power, that the family finally decided he was strong enough to join them. As he grew into a young man, the once frail Charles gradually became more robust and outgoing. He became a skilled marksman and horseman, and even took up fencing in his spare time. Even so, he was always in someone else's shadow. Charles's older brother was everything that the young prince wasn't. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was a tall and burly young man, and the people of England adored him. Charles looked up to his brother and tried to emulate him however he could, but the Prince of Wales didn't exactly reciprocate that admiration. In fact, he actively detested his sibling and would publicly humiliate him. Henry was something of a bully, but a sudden tragedy soon changed everything. The Prince of Wales seemed like a picture of health, which only made it more shocking when a sudden illness killed him at just 18 years old. The nation reeled, and thousands came to his funeral to pay respects. Leading the mourners was young Charles, who, despite his rocky relationship with his brother, was still devastated by the loss. A few years after his brother's death, Charles's mother fell gravely ill. King James rarely visited her during this period, but young Charles slept in the bedroom next to hers, rarely leaving her side. He was there next to her when she died. King James wasn't there for his wife in her final days, probably because he had other relationships to take care of. The Duke of Buckingham was one of the king's favourites, and he became a tremendous influence in court. But as the Duke gained more and more power, rumours swirled that the king's relationship with the dashing man was a little more than friendly. No matter what the exact nature of their relationship, it allowed Buckingham to quickly rise through the ranks in James's court, and that's where the trouble started. Through his relationship with the king, the Duke of Buckingham rose to the rank of Lord Admiral, effectively becoming England's foreign minister. The only problem being that he was absolutely terrible at it. He constantly fumbled military expeditions, wasting money and troops on doomed exercises. Then in 1623, the king sent Buckingham, along with Charles, to Spain in order to find a wife for the heir to the throne. Tensions between Catholics and Protestants were at an all-time high. King James hoped to ease the divide by marrying his Protestant son to the Catholic Maria Anna of Spain. But when Charles and Buckingham arrived in Spain, King Philip IV suddenly had a new set of demands. If Charles was to marry his daughter, Philip demanded that he not only convert to Catholicism, but that he stay in Spain for an entire year to make sure that it stuck. Charles was furious that the Spanish king had changed the terms of the deal, and the trip meant to forge ties between the two countries ended up having the opposite effect. When Charles and Buckingham returned to England, they forced the king to declare war on Spain instead. By this point, the king suffered from crippling arthritis and gout, and according to his doctor, his urine was the dark red colour of Alicante wine. Ugh. After a long, painful illness, King James finally died after a particularly horrible bout of dysentery. Of course, his beloved Duke of Buckingham was there by his side when he took his last breath. By this point, Buckingham and Charles had essentially taken control of the kingdom already, but now it was official. Charles became King Charles I of England, and he inherited a country in turmoil. He finally managed to find a bride in May 1625, shortly after his father died. He married Henrietta Maria of France in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. Well, not really. Charles wasn't actually there for the wedding. In fact, the couple hadn't even officially met. Since Charles was still in England, a proxy stood in for him at the wedding. The people of England hated Queen Henrietta Maria. Not only was she a Catholic, but she didn't even speak English. Hating a foreigner for not speaking the language and practicing their own religion, who'd want to live in England in the 1600s? Charles's father, James I, firmly believed in the divine right of kings. He described monarchs as gods on earth, who could essentially do whatever they wanted, and Charles felt the exact same way. He continued to rely on his father's beloved, the Duke of Buckingham. When Parliament moved to impeach Buckingham for yet another failed military expedition, Charles did the unthinkable. He ordered his guards to arrest 2 of the members who'd begun the proceedings. That Charles would arrest 2 politicians in such an obvious abuse of power scandalised the entire House of Commons. The House continued to call for Buckingham to go, so Charles went a step further. He dismissed Parliament completely. He wanted to make one thing abundantly clear. This was his country, and he was going to do what he wanted. In 1628, while drinking at a pub, an assassin killed the Duke of Buckingham. The assailant, John Felton, was a military man who'd been seriously wounded in one of the Duke's many failed military expeditions. When news of the killing reached London, the crowds rejoiced. They hailed Felton as a conquering hero. When Charles heard the news of the Duke's assassination, he burst into tears and threw himself on his bed. A year later, Henrietta Maria gave birth to a healthy son, the future Charles II of England. Throughout all of this, Charles continued using outdated laws to take every penny he could from the English people to fund his war in Spain. This led to one of the most bizarre scenes in the history of the English Parliament. In 1629, as dissent was brewing, Charles tried to end a meeting of the Parliament before anyone could speak against him. The furious members were not about to let Charles walk away scot-free, so they came up with a desperate plan. If the Speaker of the House, Sir John Finch, remained seated, Parliament could not be dismissed. So several men physically held him in his chair while they said what they needed to say. They denounced Charles's shady tax schemes, and their declarations received cheers from the rest of the House. Charles was humiliated, and it led him to take drastic action. He threw 9 of Parliament's leading members in jail and completely dissolved Parliament. He wouldn't call them again for the next 11 years. The king spent that time ruling England alone and with an iron fist, in what's now remembered as the 11 Years' Tyranny. Despite being born in Scotland and spending the first years of his life there, Charles didn't return until his coronation as King of Scotland in 1633. He ended up angering many Scots by insisting on an Anglican ceremony. Charles couldn't have cared less, but he would come to regret crossing them. The 11 Years' Tyranny came to an end thanks to Scottish bishops. Charles had stirred up the Church of Scotland by pushing the Book of Common Prayer on them in an act of reformation. In response, the Scottish bishops' wars began, which eventually forced Charles to call for Parliament to be formed once again in 1640. By this point, it was far too late to repair the relationship. Charles's days were numbered. The House of Commons openly defied him at every turn. First, they closed the loophole that he'd used to shut them out for 11 years. Next, they passed acts declaring that Parliament couldn't be dissolved without their consent. Eventually, Charles had enough of his many critics, and he came up with a plan to finally show Parliament that he was still the boss. Charles hatched a scheme to personally arrest 5 high-ranking members of Parliament in the House itself, an unprecedented move. No English monarch had ever entered the House of Commons for any reason, let alone to unlawfully arrest its members. Word of Charles's plan reached the House before the king arrived. This was the last straw. Parliament took advantage of the situation and seized London for themselves. Charles was forced to flee north to Oxford and plan his next move. The First English Civil War was upon them. If Charles was bad at being a king in peacetime, he was even worse at being a king during war. His forces kept on losing battles, and the king himself was almost kidnapped during the siege of Oxford. With his army losing ground at every turn, Charles made an unbelievable decision. He gave himself up to the Scots. He figured that the Scots hated the English government even more than they hated him. Turns out he just made the worst mistake of his life. The Scots kept Charles captive for 9 months as they negotiated ransom terms with the English Parliament. In the end, Parliament agreed to pay Scotland £100,000 to withdraw their armies and give up the king. Charles saw the writing on the wall and tried to flee to a safe haven, maybe in Europe, where he could bide his time and plan his next move. However, he made another fatal mistake. He contacted Colonel Robert Hammond, a man who he thought he could trust. He was wrong. The colonel captured him and contacted Parliament. The English Civil War led to a seismic power shift in England. While there were still some parliamentary voices who wanted to negotiate with the captive king, there was really only one voice who mattered by this point: Oliver Cromwell, leader of the new model army. Cromwell firmly believed that Charles was a tyrant. The army arrested any members of Parliament who dared challenge them and took control of England by force. It was a military coup, and it meant that now nothing could save Charles. Cromwell formed the Rump Parliament, and with them indicted Charles on the charge of treason. However, despite the fact that pretty much everyone hated Charles by this point, this action made most people extremely uncomfortable. Charles had been a selfish tyrant, but he was still the king, and kings ruled by the divine right of God. Under that view, a king literally couldn't commit treason. The House of Lords threw out the charges without even considering them. All of England's chief justices said the indictment was unlawful. But none of that was going to stop Oliver Cromwell from delivering justice. The thing about a military coup is, you don't really have to listen to anyone. The trial of King Charles I of England, the first and only such trial ever held on English soil, was coming. The English Parliament had spent decades trying to foil Charles at every turn, but when the day of his trial finally came, the vast majority of them were nowhere to be found. Only a mere 68 members of Parliament dared show their face at the trial of the king, held on January 20th, 1649 at Westminster Hall. The court claimed that Charles had used his power for his own personal gain, and not in the greater interest of his kingdom. For this, they determined that he'd committed treason against England, the punishment for which was death. Charles held firm that no court had the right to challenge the divine right of a monarch, and he would take that to his grave. Parliament proceeded to call witnesses for the next 2 days, each of whom testified to the king's crimes. In the end, none of it really mattered. Cromwell and his cronies had already made up their minds. On January 26, 1649, Charles I of England was condemned to death. If nothing else, Charles met his fate with courage. After saying a short prayer, he willingly placed his head upon the block and signalled to the headsman that he was ready. The axe took off his royal head with one precise swing. Traditionally, when someone was beheaded for treason, the executioner would hold their head up to the crowd and cry, "Behold the head of a traitor." While Charles's executioner did indeed hold the king's head aloft, he stayed completely silent, perhaps for fear of revealing his identity. Then, when he dropped the head to the ground, the soldiers who'd surrounded the scaffold rushed to take a gruesome memento. Some clipped locks of Charles's hair, while others dipped their handkerchiefs in the king's blood, a stain that would forever mark the day that England killed its own king. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.